Sergeant Daniel Kanipe's detailed eyewitness account about Custer's Battle of the Little Bighorn. Please stay tuned as we take you through the Sergeant Daniel Kanipe's eyewitness account. On June 25, 1876, Sergeant Daniel Kanipe of the United States Army participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn as a member of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, specifically within Company C. His role in the battle was significant, and he is recognized for his courage and detailed recollection of the events that transpired. Kanipe was among the few survivors of this fierce confrontation. During the subsequent court of inquiry, he provided essential testimony regarding the actions of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Kuster and the 7th Cavalry. Following the conflict, Kanipe continued his service in the Army and later authored a memoir detailing his experiences at Little Bighorn. His work, titled The Kanipe Story, is considered an important historical document for understanding the battle. Sergeant Daniel Kanipe's valor and dedication during the Battle of Little Bighorn have solidified his place in American military history. Before we proceed, we kindly ask you to support our community by liking and subscribing to our channel. Our journey commenced on May 17, 1876, leading us toward what would become a regrettable expedition. Please remember to like, subscribe, and activate notifications for further historical insights. We advanced toward the Yellowstone River, establishing our camp at the Bighorn River after a 12-mile march. We spent some time surveying the area before continuing our trek toward the Powder River around June 10th. Out of the 12 units, 6 were assigned to a reconnaissance mission. After departing from the wagon train at the Powder River, we mounted pack mules equipped with provisions for 10 days and embarked on a 2-day journey upstream. Along the Rosebud River, we discovered the Indian Trail as we redirected our course toward the Tongue River. As dusk approached, we prepared coffee and spent the night traversing the trail. The following morning, we brewed additional coffee and continued our march until midday. Upon realizing that our 10-day rations were dwindling, General Reno, the commander of our detachment, decided to retrace our steps down the Rosebud River. At the junction of the Rosebud and Yellowstone Rivers, we encountered the remaining 6 companies of the regiment under General Custer's command, along with General Terry, the department commander. It was reported that General Kuster had been detained. This detention was purportedly due to his opposition to the post merchants who had received concessions at various posts, which had been rescinded following post-ridership scandals during President Grant's administration. Acquiring goods at the post office necessitated first obtaining them from these vendors. A glass of liquor cost 25 cents, and the servings were generally modest. Custer's arrest stemmed from his imposition of a maximum price. Nevertheless, he was accompanied by other senior Army officers and was assigned command at the location mentioned. On July 22nd, Custer's contingent received a supply of food sufficient for 15 days from the steamship Far West on the river. Kuster was also accompanied by 2 Gatling guns and 2 Rodman guns, which he surrendered to General Gibbon, who transported them across the river, believing they were unnecessary. In hindsight, this decision is viewed as a mistake, as the Indians would likely have continued their retreat had he retained one of the Rodman cannons and discharged it even once. Absolutely not. They would still be running, and I wouldn't have been the only survivor if we had a Gatling gun there. In reality, there would not have been a Custer massacre. We broke camp and started moving all day on June 22nd. Kuster ordered those directions be provided by hand signals that night, that there would be no more bugle sounds, and that there would only be enough fire to make coffee. We began anew on the morning of June 23rd. After marching until almost dusk, we made camp and resumed the following morning, June 24th. On that day, we arrived at a location where the Indians had performed a war dance in addition to a sun dance. Because of their dancing, the ground was firm and smooth, and they had constructed brush huts out of cottonwood trees. The scalp of a white man was discovered by 6 Crow Indian scouts who were part of our contingent. It came from a soldier under Gibbon's leadership. Those Indians who detested the Sioux we were hunting were ecstatic to see that scalp dangling from a willow twig. They generally broke up shouting, dancing, and yelling. What were they seeking? It would have been an awful day for him if they had discovered a Sioux there. That's how crazy they were. They returned the scalp to General Custer, who examined it before passing it to the men. It was in the saddle pockets of my company's oldest line sergeant, Sergeant Finley, at the time of his death. On June 24th, we marched all day. Around 10 o'clock that evening, the Indian scouts who had been dispatched earlier returned. It was dark back then. You can see well enough to read at 9 o'clock in the summertime there. That evening, we were told to pack our equipment and saddle up. We marched through the night, approaching the point where the Little Bighorn and Rosebud Rivers converge. The regiment was led by General Custer into a gully that appeared to be a suitable location for us to remain hidden for as long as we desired. Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst lost some hardtack from the packs of the pack train as we entered at a brisk trot and gallop. Upon learning of this, General Custer instructed the sergeant to return and retrieve the bread. When the sergeant reached the site of the fallen provisions, he found 2 Indians helping themselves to the bread. Upon noticing the advancing army, the Indians fled the scene. Upon his return to camp, the sergeant reported the incident to General Custer, who then ordered us to prepare our mounts. I presumed he aimed to catch the Indians by surprise the following morning. However, given their awareness of our presence, he opted to take immediate action. After marching up the divide, we came to a halt. General Custer departed for 2 hours with 2 scouts and Henry Voss, the chief trumpeter. Upon his return, he divided the regiment into 3 detachments. He assigned 3 soldiers, A, M, and G, to Major Reno. Captain McDougall was tasked with leading the pack train alongside Troop B, while Captain Benteen was given command of 3 troops, H, K, and D. Custer retained troops C, E, I, and F for his own command. We proceeded to move out after departing from the location. Major Reno was positioned to the left of General Custer, with Captain Benteen on his left flank. It was evident that 3 distinct angles of attack would be employed against the Indian camp. Captain McDougall was to guide the pack train along the primary Indian trail. We advanced down what is now known as Benteen's Creek, until we reached a crossing where we discovered an abandoned Indian camp. The fires were still smoldering, and one of the remaining teepees contained the body of a deceased Indian. General Custer issued the command to set fire to the teepee. Upon the arrival of Major Reno, he was instructed to cross Benteen Creek, which he promptly did. Meanwhile, General Custer advanced down the creek with 3 companies. As we approached within a quarter of a mile from the confluence of Benteen Creek and the Little Bighorn, I observed Native Americans positioned atop the bluffs overlooking the river. I promptly informed First Sergeant Bobo of their presence. At that moment, General Custer glanced upward, and troops C, I, and F proceeded towards the bluffs where the Indians had been sighted. Captain Tom Kuster, the general's brother, commanded my Troop C. Despite our vigorous ride, the Indians had disappeared by the time we reached the summit. However, the teepees were visible for miles in every direction. Our Crow Indian scouts aimed to stealthily descend and capture a few ponies. A few scouts attempted to sneak down, but were met with gunfire. With us on the bluffs were Bloody Knife Reeve, a Ree or Urukara, Curly a Crow, and Chief Scout Mitch Buey. We spurred our horses to the far end of the bluffs to prepare for an assault on the Indian camp as the soldiers from the 4 companies began to shout and cheer upon spotting it in the valley below. Sergeant Finkel rode close to me, near Captain Tom Custer. He called out that he was nearing his limit, as his horse was struggling. I responded, urging him to keep going. Finkel retreated slightly, and the captain then directed me to return and find McDougall along with the Pack Train 1 to relay General Custer's recent orders. He instructed, Tell McDougal to move the pack train directly to the high ground. Do not stop to secure the packs if they come loose. Cut them off. Move swiftly." I made my way back, initially perceiving it as misfortune, but it ultimately proved to be a life-saving decision. Sergeant Finkel must have received the orders, and I would not be recounting this tale had he not retreated a few minutes prior. In the distance, I observed dust rising from the pack train, resembling a small cloud. As my group and others descended toward the Indian camp, I directed my path toward it. General Custer's last words resonate in my memory. We all rode swiftly, offering 3 cheers to the soldiers as they ascended the hill. Some riders sped past General Custer, struggling to manage their mounts. "Steady your horses, gentlemen," he called out to them. "There are plenty down there for all of us." I turned back after they had moved on. After conveying the orders to Captain McDougal at the pack train, I made my way to Captain Benteen, as I had been directed to deliver the same to him. Major Reno was in retreat from the base of the bluffs when McDougal and his men arrived at the hilltop to provide assistance. Behind them, the Indians were shouting and firing, and men were falling all around. Before we could intervene, the Indians would pounce on the fallen and scalp them. Dr. DeWolf met his end at the top of the slope. Had he advanced just a few steps further, he might have been spared. As I followed Captain Benteen back, I noticed several Indians rushing toward us. I readied my weapon, believing them to be hostile, but they turned out to be scouts fleeing the main battle. They were so frightened that they continued their flight until they reached the Powder River, having abandoned Major Reno's command. After relaying the orders to Captain Benteen, I returned to the ridge with the battalion, where we joined Major Reno and McDougal. I was unable to rejoin my company due to the presence of Indians between us and General Custer. Following an attack by the Indians, we were compelled to retreat and establish skirmish lines after Major Reno advanced onto the bluffs to confront them. A significant number of our men were lost before we could achieve our objective, and they were killed before we could reach them. After enduring a day of gunfire from the Indians, they convened at night and resumed their assault the following morning of the 26th. While I cannot ascertain the exact number, we managed to inflict considerable casualties on them. Our camp housed 68 injured individuals, and we found ourselves cut off from a water supply. It was devastating to hear the pleas of an injured man who was in dire need of water, yet we were powerless to assist him. Some of our men were shot while attempting to fetch water, and they were unable to return with any for the wounded. I vividly remember the first shot fired during the 2-day engagement. It struck the ground nearby and passed directly beneath my horse. 2 officers, Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis, along with 14 soldiers, were never found. Reports indicated that during the Indians' nighttime celebrations, they had decapitated them and paraded their heads. The Indians killed 56 of our men on the hill. On the 26th, the gunfire persisted throughout the day. By late evening, we observed the camp beginning to mobilize. While the women were occupied with packing, the warriors continued their barrage against us. On the morning of the 27th, there was not a single Indian in sight. We prepared coffee, gathered some water, and did our utmost to care for the injured. General Gibbon and his troops arrived around 10 o'clock. He was accompanied by General Terry, the commanding officer. We greeted General Terry with great enthusiasm, and he was so moved that he wept openly. The complete destruction of General Custer and his 4 companies became evident when he later reported observing 200 troops in the valley below. It is possible that he had been ensnared in a manner similar to our own assumptions. Later that afternoon, on the 27th, I was granted permission to accompany Captain Benteen to the battlefield, where I was free to explore the area at my discretion. As I surveyed the deceased, I recognized several acquaintances, including a sergeant I was familiar with. Among the fallen, I identified Sergeants Finkel and Finley. Sergeant Finley lay at the head of his horse, Carlo, with 12 arrows embedded in his body. The bodies had been exposed to the sun for 2 days, bloodied and disfigured. After the removal of their clothing, women and young Native Americans would repeatedly strike the living men in the face with tomahawks or shoot them with arrows, making it evident which individuals had sustained injuries. They only inflicted harm on those who were alive, never on the deceased. None of the bodies retained any clothing. Everything had been taken by the Native Americans. They likely acquired approximately $25,000 in cash, as we had just received our pay at Powder River Camp before embarking on this campaign, leaving us with no means to spend it. I could see where the last of them had fallen, gathered in a small heap. Only a portion of General Custer's back rested on the ground as he lay across a few men. He was surrounded by the deceased, with a bullet wound piercing his heart. This final group included my captain, Tom Kuster, the general's brother, and his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, who commanded H Troop. Excluding the women, there were approximately 4,000 Native Americans involved in the conflict, contributing to a total of 12,000 to 15,000 Native Americans engaged overall. Custer and his soldiers faced an insurmountable force. Not a single living being remained on the battlefield to recount the events that transpired following the defeat of Custer and his 4 companies. Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche, was the sole survivor of the massacre. Comanche sustained 7 gunshot wounds before he was finally found. Among the deceased soldiers, many Native Americans were also discovered. Approximately 75 Native Americans were located within 3 standing teepees, and it is difficult to ascertain how many more were taken as the camp of the Native Americans relocated. One individual I encountered was clad in buffalo robes and blankets. I was taken aback to find that he possessed 4 women's scalps, 2 of which had long red hair hanging from a string as lengthy as my arm when I extricated him. I promptly discarded the scalps due to the gruesome nature of the scene. I did not wish to be associated with such a disturbing trophy. After the battle, we buried our fallen comrades before embarking on the arduous task of transporting the wounded to the steamboat heading west. The steamer was compelled to withdraw to the Yellowstone River after reaching the furthest point possible upstream. A significant number of injured soldiers were brought aboard the steamboat for medical assistance. Fortunately, most of the wounded individuals made remarkable recoveries from their injuries. Among the survivors was the old Comanche, the sole survivor of Custer's ill-fated engagement. As a testament to the events of that tragic day, General Headquarters mandated that this horse would spend the remainder of his life in a box stall. Comanche received care from a soldier of the 7th Cavalry Band and was prominently featured at the front of the regiment during dress parades, draped in a black mourning cloth. In the aftermath of the battle, the Native Americans simply dismantled their camp and resumed their journey. My regiment, which had also taken part in the conflict, was not in a position to pursue them. We were all too severely injured and demoralized to mount an effective counteroffensive. The Native Americans managed to escape without incurring further losses after achieving a decisive victory. I trust that this personal account provides you with a different perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos. Wishing you a pleasant day, and I look forward to our next meeting. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more captivating historical content.